Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Hope you guys are doing absolutely phenomenal today. This is the Sohail and Yasin podcast. We're going to come up with a more official name as we get more repetition into this game of becoming podcast hosts. But as always, my name is Yasin, and I'm here with my awesome, fantastic co-host and good friend, Sohail.
Yep, that is me. I'm here.
And so this last week has been a little bit of an off week for Sohail and I in terms of not only figuring out what kind of topics we wanted to really touch base on, and just really making sure that the rest of our lives were keeping up with all of the madness that is living in the post-pandemic apocalyptic world of coronavirus. And so the topic that Sohail and I were kind of brainstorming before we jumped into today's podcast was the topic of taqwa. And so do you want to kind of give a preliminary, Sohail, about why it is that we decided to go a little bit onto the taqwa topic?
Yeah. So I guess the overarching thing of what I originally was falling into this past week was just like losing focus on Islam as like the center point of everything. And when it comes to like family and friends, when it comes to work, in my case, which is school, and when it comes to like your passion, I guess, I've been kind of slacking in that when I feel like I'm falling behind in one of them, I kind of like drop it all. And especially if, for me, feeling like my deen side of life isn't intact, everything else sort of kind of crumbles under it. And Yassine mentioned the topic of taqwa specifically. So I'll kind of just hand it off to you to give more of like a background of that.
Yeah, totally. So the reason I think taqwa is one of the most underrepresented topics that I think is not fully really understood, not only by non-Arabs, but Arabs as well, just Muslims as whole, right? Because a lot of people say, oh yeah, I'm a non-Arab, therefore I don't understand what taqwa means because it's an Arabic term. But the truth is that I had a conversation with a buddy of mine where we were talking about how these basic topics of tawakkul, taqwa, shukr, qadar, all these are topics that I know a lot of people have heard as buzzwords, but oftentimes for us living in the modern world, right, and living in 2020, for us, we don't really have a conceptual understanding of what those topics mean because the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, like they had like a understanding of those topics, but today we're just like buzzwords. We don't really understand what they mean. And so I proposed to Sohail that possibly the issue that kind of threw not only him off, but me off in the last couple of weeks in terms of our work and the rest of our lives, our personal lives, our work lives, our school lives, was our level of taqwa. And so the conversation then became like, okay, well, what's taqwa? And I was like, okay, bro, we can talk about it on the podcast. It'll be awesome. Like, I'll have to define taqwa. We can go into there. So I think today's podcast is very valuable to talk about taqwa. And I'm interested, Sohail, to get your thoughts as I kind of explain this, because I haven't publicly explained this many times to a lot of people. And so I think there's probably a lot of gaps in the way I explain it. So I would really, really love for you to kind of chime in and ask any questions as we kind of go along here.
Yeah, let's dive into it.
Sweet. So my obsession with taqwa has been going on for, I think, over a decade now, because of the fact that Islam, obviously, there's a famous biographer who said that Islam is a very unique religion because their prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he wasn't Muslim, so he just said their prophet, taught them how to do things from the very little of how to use the restroom all the way to how to actually run a state. So it kind of encompasses the entire A to Z amalgam of how to, live your life and the state and the community and the society and all that stuff. But on the personal level, the number one objective of all of Islam on the personal level is to increase the taqwa of individuals. Like if you look at across the board, you look at the word taqwa in the Quran, like even if you look at the ayah of how to, like the reason why we fast, it's in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامَ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So that you may become more of those people who are muttaqeen. Right? In the first 5 ayat of Surah Al-Baqarah, هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ, that the Quran is a guidance for those who are لِلْمُتَّقِين. And so the concept of taqwa has such an important, significant emphasis on literally the purpose of anything we do in deen is to increase our level of taqwa. And yet when we try to, like, if I ask somebody what is taqwa, they'll be like, I think it means like fear of Allah. I think it means like, I don't know what it means. And so I think it's valuable for us to kind of pause here for a second and just have a discussion about what you and I, Sohail, think that the general population, or what you and I think taqwa is, just so that we can kind of have a list of those and then touch base on that throughout the podcast today. So if I was to ask you, Sohail, there's no right or wrong here, so don't feel like this is not like some kind of lesson or a halaqah or something we're going. This is just like a general discussion that we're having. from what you've studied, right? Because you've obviously gone through some classes in the past, some Arabic lessons and things like that. What would you say your understanding of taqwa is, and just kind of laying it all out there?
All right, so I think, like you said, the just being conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at all times is generally what I think of when I think of taqwa. Sheikh Mukhtar used to always, this is like his one thing that he would always preach about, always being God conscious. And I think just in more general terms, it just means that in your day-to-day, whatever you're doing, in every single activity, in every single act, you should have a way of connecting it back to your deen, or just knowing that every single thing you do has a deen consequence, I guess. Like there could be a negative aspect of it in your spirituality, or there could be a positive aspect of it in your spirituality. So I think it just comes down to that. I think that's how I would personally define it.
So when you say like God consciousness, like practically, what does that mean? So it's like, okay, I want to increase my taqwa level. Like what does that mean, God consciousness?
Yeah. So Abdurrahman Murphy, in one of his coffee talks, I quote people a lot just because it's better than quoting myself, you know. But the way he defined, or the way he talks about sinning, is that in the moment that you choose to do a sin, you inherently forget that the day of judgment exists. And by this, he means that the day of judgment obviously is something that we all at least are told to fear and are told to be mindful of at all times, but we don't necessarily obviously keep that at the forefront of our minds, especially mortality, death, all that. It's Islamically preached to always have that at the forefront of our minds. And I think a byproduct of that is just knowing that there is a consequence to every single one of your actions, and that everything you do somehow can lead you either towards a worse akhirah or a better akhirah. So I think in God consciousness, it's just that whether I'm talking to somebody and I'm mindful of the way I'm talking to them, the way I'm giving them attention, the way I'm listening, or whether it's dealing with my parents and listening when I should be, or just obviously just using the internet, like making sure I'm conscious of the things I'm looking at, the things I'm listening to. I think in every single act, it just comes down to how is this activity going to affect me in the spiritual sense of my eternal demise, I guess, if you want to think of it in that sense. So I think just God consciousness just comes down to being mindful in your day-to-day activities.
Yeah, I think so. I think you almost pretty much hit it on the head with the mindfulness aspect towards the tail end of your explanation there. And for me, it's been a similar journey of being obsessed with taqwa and kind of being like, okay, what does taqwa actually mean? And I'm now convinced that taqwa is the secret to individuals being able to buy their own Lambos. And I think it's also the secret for people having eternal happiness, and it's a secret to having the life that you want in the dunya as well as the life that you want in the akhirah. And let me explain why. The easiest way, so first off, from an Islamic context, let's look at what does taqwa mean from an Islamic context. There's hadith of Rasulullah ﷺ that he defines taqwa in a context. There's a saying of Ali radiallahu anhu where he defines taqwa mukhafatu min al-jaleel, and he goes on to define taqwa. But the most famous explanation of taqwa that I think has gotten the most traction, which maybe you might be familiar with this one, Sohail, which is often misquoted to actually be from Umar radiallahu anhu, which is the whole thobe example with the thorns. Have you heard of that one?
Maybe if you say it, it'll jog my memory.
Okay, so typically people quote this to Umar radiallahu anhu, but it's actually to Ubay ibn Ka'b radiallahu anhu. So the example is Umar radiallahu anhu asked Ubay ibn Ka'b radiallahu anhu, what is the definition of taqwa? Now, if you guys don't know who Ubay radiallahu anhu is he's basically the qari of the ummah. He actually Sabbih isma rabbika al-a'la was a surah that was specifically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told Rasulullah to recite it specifically to Ubay ibn Ka'b. Like Ubay ibn Ka'b is very, very high up there as Sahaba. He's just not very well known. So when Umar radiallahu anhu asked Ubay ibn Ka'b radiallahu anhu, what is taqwa? He basically defined it in a metaphor. He said, imagine that you are going to be walking on a path that has a lot of thorns coming up. Okay, and then he asked Umar radiallahu anhu, how would you walk on that path? And so Umar radiallahu anhu said, I would take my thobe. Now, they didn't have thobes back then. They were in Arab dress. So the term thobe is not specifically that was used in there, right? Like the clothes that you're wearing. He said that I would be I would be very, very cognizant, and I would be extremely conscious of where my clothes were, like at every given moment, because I don't want them to get pricked by any of the thorns that are on this path that I'm going. right? So you're extremely you're walking through this thing and you're like, you're pulling one clothes here, you're pulling your shirt here, you're like, like if you ever tried to, when I was a kid, we always used to have like these bushes in the back of our backyard, and then past the bushes was like this field we used to play in. And so we used to always try to look for like this hole between the bushes to like kind of like walk through. And so you're going through this thing, and you're like, and you don't want to get hit by any of the branches, and so you're just like, you're like dodging these branches, and you're trying to go through there. That's kind of what he was essentially demonstrating taqwa to be as. Now, it touches very closely on the topic of mindfulness that you said, right? So it's like you're very mindful of like, okay, where's the branch? What's happening here? What am I actually going through? The more contemporary example that I always give that I think resonates with a lot of people is taqwa is essentially the feeling that you have when you're going through TSA as a Muslim. Where as you're going through TSA, you are so cognizant of like every movement, like taking your laptop out of the bag and you're putting it there. You know that people are watching you. You're like, bro, like especially Sohail, Masha got the beautiful beard rocking, and he's like, and so like that's one example that I give. The second example that I give that I think resonates with a lot of people is taqwa is the feeling that you get when you're driving your car, and then all of a sudden you see that there's a police officer behind you. And then you literally are watching like every mile an hour on your speedometer. You're making sure that you put the blinker on every single time. Like when there's a stop sign, you're like, you stop, and then you like give it an extra 2 seconds, and you're like, okay, there you go, I stopped, right? Like that moment where you're so mindful and conscious of every single small thing that you're doing because you know that there's somebody who's watching you. You're being extremely deliberate about what it is that you're doing. Right? And so that's one aspect of taqwa, which is the consciousness that you always have in mind that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always watching me, period. That feeling that happens, that is a feeling of taqwa. The other aspect of taqwa is being present in the exact moment that you're in right now. The reason being is because I want you to think about this. It's going to sound like a very abstract topic that I'm about to say right now, is that it is impossible to make ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the future, and it's impossible to make ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the past. You can only make ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the exact present moment that you're in right now. So like for example, when you're praying salah, the only way for you to have khushu' is to remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching you when? In the future, in the past? No, at this exact moment. And so taqwa is like this combination of mindfulness, presentness, and being extremely deliberate and conscious of like the life that you're living right now. And that's all encompassed in this concept of taqwa essentially. And so that's one aspect, and I'm going to add the final layer to this, which is taqwa is the easiest translation for taqwa is consciousness in general, God consciousness as well as consciousness of reality. So that means that basically what you're doing is, if you have a high level of taqwa, you are conscious constantly of the fact of what is actually true in the life, like what is actually priority, what is not true, like what is not important. And so as you're going through life, and if you have a high level of taqwa, let's say for example somebody pisses you off. If you have a high level of taqwa, like if somebody cuts you off and you have road rage or something, if you have a high level of taqwa, you'll be like, okay, well, in the grand scheme of things, the only thing that really matters is like, am I being a good Muslim? Am I doing things that are right, against other people? That Jannah is going to happen. There's Yawm al-Qiyamah. There's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's Rasul. Those are the only things that are real reality. Everything else is just like a game that I'm playing in the dunya, basically. Like this entire dunya is like a short-term like game that I'm playing, and then the real life starts when I die, and then you have like the real life. And so your consciousness level is specific to how much you're able to remember that fact regularly throughout your life. I'll get off my pulpit for a second, and I'll let you just because I know I'm kind of a little bit all over.
No, yeah, I was smiling because I remember one time we were walking, doing our Fajr walks, and there was that one day where we came to that, like we sat down on the bench and we were like hyper analyzing the lenses that we have between the way we perceive the world and then what reality actually is. And Dr. Sherman Jackson talked about how, I don't want to quote anything because I don't want to get it wrong, but he talked about how Imam Shafi, he was somebody who didn't like that Islam was getting into hands of non-Arabs because they couldn't perceive Islam the way that Arabs did, at least in his perception, because they are the ones who had the culture that was attached to Islam. They were raised as Arabs. They were given the Quran in the context of who they were and their background. And when somebody who isn't raised in that background tries to interpret the Quran, in his perception or the way that we learned it is that he didn't inherently like that because to them it was taking away half the meaning, right? And the reason I bring that up is because it's interesting to think of, or I guess for me, it's interesting to think of Islam as more of a worldview in that when you start thinking about all the things you learn as you grow up and you think of those as like the way to think, and I guess using the Quran as your linguistic worldview of like guiding you throughout your life, then all of these other things are like those thorns, and you actually can like align yourself in that way of like wrapping yourself in Islam as the way you think, and then everything else just being outside of it. And obviously the way Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam taught us to deal with each of those things, we'd like inherently know how to, I guess, weave through the thorns.
Yeah, totally. I think, and just to clarify here, because I know that a lot of us, especially as non-Arabs, we sometimes feel like there's a little bit of a hierarchy game here. We're like, oh, Arabs, they must understand so much more. The truth is that even in the time of Imam Shafi'i, rahimahullah, in his time, like the Arabs were true Arabs. My mashayikh nowadays, they call the Arabs, my mashayikh, by the way, are Arab. They call them A'rab. A'rab basically means like Bedouins, which rhymes with Arab. Because the reason being is because even the Arab in today's time have completely lost context of the culture aspect of it, the meaning aspect of it. So they are not in any way, shape, or form in a different situation. Sometimes I know that for us as non-Arabs, we're like, oh, there must be like the grass is greener on the other side. Like if I only understood things on the other side, my life and my worldview and like everything would be completely different. But the truth is that it's at an ummah level. Like the lack of understanding of deen is not only specific to non-Arabs, it's also heavily based on the Arab side as well. So I just thought I would clarify that. But yeah, I think you're spot on in that the cultural aspect, by us not really having these terms, like these buzzwords, shukr, tawakkul, taqwa, without us having the cultural aspect of it, the way that I kind of talked about, like the police officer, the TSA, and then mindfulness, because we hear these things, right? There's a mindfulness movement, there's a being present in the moment. And the reason why I believe that taqwa is the key to living a happy and prosperous life in the dunya as well as the akhirah is because in Islam, every act that we do on the individual level is meant to increase our taqwa level. So even salah, zakah, fasting, all of those have evidences in the Quran, the hadith, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So that way you may be amongst those who have taqwa, right? But then the question might be, why is that? Like, why is taqwa given such a high importance? And my opinion is that the reason why taqwa is at that pedestal is because the concepts of tawakkul, shukr, being able to focus in life, like all these concepts that we have, for me, I see them as things that come as a result of having a high level of taqwa. Because if you don't have taqwa, you cannot have shukr. What does that mean? If you are not able to step back from your life and realize like, oh snap, this entire life is just a game like I'm playing. Like imagine, this is exactly how you can imagine it. You're like in this movie or in this video game, and you're like this character in this video game, and you just have to realize for a second that like, oh snap, whatever happens to this character in this video game, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with who I am as a person, because who I am as a person is who I'm going to be judged by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm going to be judged, like there's different criteria of what I have. It's not this character is rich, if this character is poor, if this character is smart, if this character is dumb, if this character has straight A's, if this character has straight C's. Like irrespective of what this character has in this video game is not reflective of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees me and what standing I have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is the actual thing, that's the only thing that actually matters. And so what you do is you then separate yourself from the character in the video game that is Yasin and Sohail, and you'd be like, okay, so there's a video game that's going on, which is life, and there's a character in this video game that might be on track with his studies, he might not be on track with his studies. He might be on track with his goals, he might not be on track with his goals. He might have the business he wants, he might not have the business he wants. He might have the life that he wants, he might not have the life that he wants. But that is irrelevant to the standing that I am in with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is the only thing that matters. So that is actually the purpose, like that state of mind that I just demonstrated right now is actually the purpose of why we have salah, siyam, zakat, hajj. That state of mind that I just said right now is all of those are just reminders for us to get into that state of mind like, oh snap, this entire life thing is just a game. And I'm just a character in this game. And the only thing that actually matters is my standing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
That's interesting. So viewing your life as from a third person point of view, like you said beforehand, is a way of kind of taking yourself out of context of any of the struggles or worries that you have on a personal basis, and kind of, I guess, this kind of clicked in my head because I've been having an issue of defining like happiness, I guess, because obviously there's like two sides of it. Everybody's like, okay, you have to enjoy the journey to get to wherever you want. So like happiness is like now, right? Like you have to be defined or define yourself as a happy person in order to, like you mentioned last time about the RAS, like you find these things that'll link you back to your happiness and it'll confirm your identity. And I think it's easier said than done a lot of the times with that, because you fall into these little events that'll come up that kind of put you down or kind of make you feel a certain type of way, and then you kind of let everything else crumble down. But Sheikh Mukhtar also mentioned this once about how achieving sakina and like inner tranquility comes through simply detaching yourself from everything else in the world and only having one single attachment in your heart. And there's a whole like tangent here about like the amount of sacrifice you put into it, and how obviously as the higher in status you want to get with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more sacrifice you have to have. He talked about like Ibrahim alayhi salam, and how just the act of him being there to consciously have to cut his son, and that moment Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him the gift of detaching his love for his son and replacing it with the love of Allah. And his son's love of his life was replaced with the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's like, this is a tangent, but I guess the main idea here is that like, as you go through life, there are these trials that come up, and obviously they'll be harder and harder. And those are just a means of testing you to see whether you will be able to detach from those worldly things that you're conscious of and kind of bring it back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as like the main focus. And I brought this up just because happiness, I guess, in that case would be defined as being in a good place with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then allowing everything else to kind of just be extra in that scenario where like you are thinking of it from that third person point of view and you're not really putting value. This is where I kind of, sorry, go ahead.
So I apologize, I'm kind of cutting in here, but because the reason being is because you brought up some really good points, and I want to kind of dive into those here for a second. So you mentioned happiness quite a few times. And I think that this concept of happiness is one that is very interesting and one that I have a lot of strong thoughts on. So I think I would love to dive into it with you a little bit if you're okay with that. When you say happiness, are you talking about the feeling of happiness? Are you talking about contentment? Are you talking about satisfaction? Like are you talking about the feeling? Are you talking about the state of mind? What are you talking about when you talk about happiness?
I think in my head, the definition of happiness, obviously it's like being content, being satisfied with where you are, and just being in that constant state of just bliss, I guess, peace, right? You're just at peace with yourself. But I guess there's this like longing of feeling like, you know, when you're hanging out with friends and like after a long time, you kind of feel that joy and that happiness of just like, okay, I'm like you kind of detach from the worries that you have in your day to day. And you can kind of just put yourself in this place of like, okay, now I don't have to worry about all that stuff. I'm in a place where I don't have these struggles. I don't have these worries. I don't have these responsibilities. And you can kind of take yourself out of it. And for me, in my head, the definition of happiness is getting to the point in your day-to-day where those responsibilities, those tasks, those worries don't affect you. And you're still able to stay in that feeling. It's a very shaky definition, but you don't necessarily view responsibility as being a burden on your shoulder, but more of a empowerment. And you feel more at peace, I guess, through those things that you have to do on the day-to-day. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I've heard this a lot, and this is something that I myself thought for a very long time until I one day came across learning more about how the brain works, and I started to realize that what we're talking about here in this concept of happiness, and the reason why people have difficulty defining happiness is because there's a fundamental misunderstanding of how feelings work in the body and in the brain. So let me explain a little bit more. So everything that you feel right now, right? All of your feelings, a lot of people get tied to their feelings. Like, I want to feel happy. I want to feel content. I want to feel. The truth is that all of the feelings, that your entire spectrum of feelings that you have, all of those really just stem from thoughts that occur. So like you have this thought, which is like, oh, I'm supposed to be doing this homework piece that I'm putting off right now. As a result of that, what you do then is you put meaning on top of that thought, and therefore that generates feelings. Okay, so all feeling comes from thought, and then on top of that, whatever meaning you put onto that thought, that's how you generate your feelings. Okay, so, and then let me ask you real quick here, is that thoughts, are you of the opinion that you can control your thoughts, or do you feel like thoughts are just something that's like in your head?
I think thoughts in your head, but you can choose which ones to place value in or not.
Right. So would you agree with me that on any given moment, like you could just go out there right now and watch the news, and then all of a sudden you'd have a whole bunch of thoughts about, like, external environment puts thoughts in your head. So some thoughts are from you, some thoughts are from the external environment, but you just have like a flood of thoughts that are coming all the time.
Yeah.
Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah.
And then from there you can decide what thoughts you want to entertain and which thoughts you don't want to entertain.
Mm-hmm.
Can we agree on that?
Yeah.
And then based on the thoughts that you entertain, you start putting meaning on those thoughts. As a result, they generate your feelings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so if it's as fickle as literally watching the news that can generate for you a thought, and then you put meaning on that thought, and then all of a sudden it impacts your feeling, isn't feeling something that is like very, very like fickle? Isn't that something that's like if you're chasing your feeling, but feeling can be influenced literally by a thought, isn't feeling maybe not the best thing to be chasing in life?
But so then you're defining, like, your general state of mind isn't defined by feelings. You're saying that that's independent of. You're saying feelings are those event-based, thought-based emotions that arise because you attach an emotion to a specific thought, and then you get a feeling from that.
Right. And and now if you want to go into neuroscience here, there's a million different chemicals, right? If you watch something that has a lot of cuts in it on YouTube, all of a sudden you have this thought and you have a feeling, and then dopamine gets released in your brain, and you might have a spike or you might have a low. But your well-being, like how your actual state of well-being is irrespective of the thought. Like the thoughts and the feelings are up here. Imagine your brain, right? You have your thoughts and your feelings that are out here, and then your well-being is something that is much deeper than any thoughts or feelings that you might have, because those things they have turnover. You might have a thought come here, feeling come here, thought come here, feeling here. You might feel happy one moment, you feel sad one moment. Like those things have such a high turnover that has nothing to do with your internal well-being of like your contentment, your happiness. For me, contentment and happiness and how your overall shukr, gratitude, all those things are much deeper than whatever your thoughts or your feelings might be in that given moment.
That makes sense. But okay, so then in that scenario, or in that,
and so
go ahead.
Let me go into this, and then maybe this will help a little bit more. So when we talk about taqwa, so let's go back to where we were before. This concept of taqwa is related to the deeper well-being and the state that you're in deeper.
Okay. Sorry, I was asking for my charger.
Okay, it's all good. It's all good. Cool. So going back to what we were talking about with taqwa, right? So taqwa is basically being in the state of mind that everything that is going on in your life right now is basically just a game, and it has nothing to do with your innate well-being, right? Your innate well-being, like Sohail, his innate well-being has to do with his relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's irrespective of whatever else is happening in life. So whatever thoughts, whatever feelings, whatever you have going on in your life, that is irrelevant to what Sohail's net worth is. Like your net worth is actually defined as like the fact that you're alive, that has a net worth to it. Like you're already valuable, the fact that you were born a human being and you're healthy and you're in America and all these things, right? And so your happiness, if we already defined happiness, if you're defining happiness as a feeling, then your feelings are based on your thoughts, and therefore your happiness will go in and out depending on how you feel at any given moment. But if you're defining happiness as a state of being, that is something that has much deeper to do with any thoughts or feelings that you might be having at that given moment. Right? And so your happiness is not determined, happiness is a mindset, not a feeling, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I guess the issue I always have with this is figuring out the practical side of it, because abstractly it makes sense how we choose what emotions we attach to what thoughts based on just our worldview, right? The way we think about things, the way we act on a day-to-day basis, our emotions will affect different thoughts in different ways. But I guess the issue here would be detaching yourself from that event-based feeling thing and bringing yourself to that, okay, I am happy right now. I am feeling good. I'm in a good state of mind, and convincing yourself that all of those thoughts are just extra. I think doing that practically is difficult because it feels like you always have to be on guard, I guess, or you have to always be it's kind of ironic because I was going to say it feels like you always have to be mindful, but I guess that's the point then, that you always have to be conscious of those thoughts that are occurring and conscious of the fact that you can't control the emotions you attach to those thoughts. And so anytime that those feelings come about, you have to just remind yourself that this is just a feeling. I'm still like at peace. My life is in order. This is just an external factor. Is that just
Yeah, you're basically spot on there, because it's what it is. It's a habit of consciousness. You have to start to develop the habit of consciousness to not identify with the character. So what the biggest illusion of all of life is when the video game character convinces you that you are the video game character. Like the video game character wants you to be like, hey, everything is on the line. If we don't pass this test right now, you're going to be a failure of life, and your entire life is going to be worth nothing. If you don't get, if you don't get the business that you want, if you don't want the car you want, if you don't get the wife that you want to marry, if your parents are upset, like the biggest illusion of the nafs is that the nafs wants you to believe that you and the nafs are one. When in reality, we know that there's the nafs and the ruh. I'm not going to go into the abstract spirituality of this, but the point being is that in any given moment, you always have to remind yourself oh snap, I'm taking life too seriously right now. I almost try to practice it 10 times an hour. I always try to ground myself and be whoa, I got carried away with my thoughts. My thoughts took me to a different place. And the more I've practiced that 10 times every single hour, where I just be who am I? Where am I? What am I doing right now? Whoa, I sometimes literally be I just transported back to where I am right now, because my thoughts will take me to a different dimension. I'll be thinking about something's going to happen in the past. I'm thinking about something happening in the future. And then I'll take a second and be okay, wait a second. Who am I? I'm Yasin. Where am I? I'm sitting in this conference room right now. What am I doing? I'm talking to Sohail. As soon as I answer those 3 questions for myself, I'm ground myself in the present moment. Whoa, where did I go? My thoughts took me to a different place. And that's what the nafs does. That's what this whole video game character thing does, is it makes you start thinking life is more serious than it actually is. And you start to lose sight of the bigger picture, which is oh snap, this is all just a game. This is all just a dunya. Dunya is just it's a fun toy that you can have. And then once you start, the funny thing about this is a catch-22, it's a paradox. Because once you start to think of life as a game, you start to be able to play it a little bit less seriously. And when you play it less seriously, you actually get better results at the game. When you're not afraid to play life all out, and you're not afraid to take risks, you actually are able to do things more boldly. And then when you do things more boldly, greater risk, greater reward, and you get better reward for it. Physical, tangible dunya reward. Because you're not taking life so seriously. You're not so afraid to put yourself out there, because you're bro, what does it matter if that guy judges me for who I am? Because it's all a game anyways. You're bro, what does it matter if I try to start this business and I fail? Because it's just a game anyways. What does it matter if my parents maybe are not the best at me because I decided not to become a doctor? Because it's just a game anyways. It doesn't matter. And then all of a sudden, you start taking it less seriously. And this is why the ummah has got it completely backwards. It's because your parents are actually ingraining you to live a taqwa less lifestyle. They're making you think that life is so important. Bro, you have to take the safe job. If you don't take the safe job, everything. But wait a second, rizq is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm going to die anyways. Why don't I just play the game all out? And so the generation, what they've done is they've ingrained this taqwa, meaningless lifestyle into our brains, where they try to make us if you have true taqwa, you realize oh, I can do whatever I want in the dunya, and it doesn't matter because that's not the game. The game is not the dunya. The game is the akhirah.
So taqwa is the way to get a Lambo.
There you go, bro. Connected taqwa is the way that you have shukr also, because if you don't have a high level of consciousness, you can't have shukr for what it is that you want. If you're not able to separate yourself from the game, right? If you think the game is everything, then you can't step back and have acknowledgement of the blessings that you already have. Because you're always looking at oh snap, I don't have what it is that I want. I don't have the grades that I want. I don't have the job that I want. I don't have the life that I want. It's very hard for you to then to look at what it is that you do have and make shukr for what it is that you do have. But if you can step away from the game for a second, and if you can be like, oh snap, it's not that serious anymore. Alhamdulillah, look at me. I have, I'm healthy. I live, here. I have family. I have this. Oh snap, it's not that serious. Therefore, you can have shukr. And like we talked about in the previous episode, la in shakartum la azidannakum, the thing that you can have more shukr of, the more that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will increase you for. And so that's how you win the game, is when you step back, you have a higher level of taqwa, you can make shukr for that thing, you make shukr for the little money that you do have, and then all of a sudden you get more money. And then you're like, oh snap, I got even more money, let me make more shukr of that, and you have more. So taqwa is what allows you to have shukr, it's what allows you to have tawakkul, because the only way you can have tawakkul, by letting go of kind of control everything, is by stepping back and being like, oh, it's a game, I don't have control over all the pieces of the game anyways. I can only put in my effort from the game. And again, it comes down to having that taqwa, the higher level of consciousness, to be able to step back from the game and be like, oh snap, it's just a game. And that is why salah, zakah, fasting, all of that is just there to remind us of that cue. Hey bro, it's just a game. Hey bro, it's just a game. Like, this is literally when I start praying salah, I'm like, oh snap, I'm about to start realizing that it was just a game. That's the state of mind that I leave myself with after I finish praying salah. Because then I'm able to combat the rest of life so much more aggressively. Because I just finished salah, I'm like, oh bro, I just remembered it's all just a game. It makes sense now. Cool. Time to go attack life again.
Interesting. Okay. So you view salah as a way of keeping yourself at that third person point of view of life.
It's not my view. This is the reason why Allah revealed salah and dua, and all of these are tools that Allah. This is the whole purpose. This is what people miss about Islam. The whole purpose of Islam on the personal level. Remember, there's different levels of this game, right? There's the nation level. There's Islam as a constitution. Islam as a society. There's different things. But on the personal level, the entire game of I don't want to say the game of Islam. The entire purpose of Islam is to put the individual into taqwa. Now, out of those actions, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us all these tools, right? Out of these tools that we have, some of them are put to the pedestal of fara'id. Some of them are likable. Some of them are, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prioritized these for us out of all the tools that we have. But all of these tools are meant for one purpose, which is to put us into the state of taqwa, because that then gives us more shukr, it gives us more akhlaq, it gives us more, because it's hard to have road rage and be angry at your wife when you realize like, oh, it's just a game. Like, why am I angry at my wife for not cooking, making what salt was in the food or whatever, right? The key to akhlaq is also taqwa, because you have a higher level of akhlaq, you have a higher level of moral self-being when you realize it's just a game. You don't want to cheat people in business because you're like, bro, it's just a game. Why would I sacrifice my integrity? The only people who cheat people in the dunya are people who take the game so seriously that they're like, oh, if I don't cheat this person, then like I'm gonna have no financial gain. And so that you have less akhlaq because you think that this game is so serious that this is the only thing that exists. And so all of the things in life are really just there. All the things that the tools that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us is to elevate our taqwa level.
Dang, it's a lot easier to think about tawakkul in that framework, because you pull yourself out of your current life, I guess, and you just, that's interesting. You just leave it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take care of the game for you, and you're just a bystander to the way it's working. Interesting.
You're just a player in the video game, bro, and you control the video game. You control the video game character. Like the whole game, it's all a game, and you're a character in the game, and your job is to control this character. So sometimes this character gets a level up and he gets he gets the A on the test. Sometimes he doesn't. But your goal is not what you got on the test. Your goal is to work on building the character, like if he studies or not. Like your goal is to tell Sohail, like, yo bro, you got to study right now. Like your goal is to tell Sohail, like, yo bro, you got to send out the direct outreach messages for business so that way we can get more clients. You control the character of Sohail. You are not Sohail.
Bro, thinking about this in terms of the covenant that we've given to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then we were given this life, and it dang, it actually makes you think of the life as a video game, because at some point we die and then the video game's over, but our souls still return to Allah. Damn. Okay, wait, I had something I wanted to also ask, because you mentioned you about 10 times an hour you pull back and you kind of just remind yourself. Do you want to just go into that real quick?
Yeah. So again, like I said, there's tools that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us to increase our level of consciousness, right? The goal of all of life is to get to a point where you're just always living in a state of consciousness that you're able to play life fearlessly because you're always just at a higher level of consciousness, right? So when you're in the meeting, you're able to have like, you can like, if something, let's say for example, like the other day what happened was a client of ours, she wasn't able to pay her monthly, like her what she's supposed to pay us, and so we lost like, $500 or $600, right? So we go into the meeting, and then my admin assistant Jane, she's like, oh yeah, this client didn't pay, so we lost $500-600. And so my initial thing was, I was like, dude, like, I mean, 500, 600, it's not a big deal, but it's like, it's annoying to lose $500-600, right? And so then I just started laughing, because I just started realizing, oh, it's just a game. Like, it's not that big of a deal. Like, I was just like, on to the next. And so when you approach life with this joyous attitude, the funny thing that happened was like literally 2 days after that, my sales guy, he closed another deal that was like $600. And so like sometimes this entire life, these concepts of like, oh, if you give money for sadaqah, shaitan wants you to be faqir, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give it back to you in so much different ways that you don't understand. Sometimes it just takes for you to step back and realize like, oh, like there's this character in this game, and I don't understand how this entire game works. All I am in control of is the character and what my character does.
It's a very meta way to think, because at that moment you laugh at it, and in your head you're like, that at some point Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will kind of come back and provide something in a different way, or you have that tawakkul like inherently, right? Like that just comes by.
And so going back to your question about 10 times an hour, so again, when you go into the car, you read the dua of safar, right? The reason you read the dua of safar is to put you into level of consciousness. Subhanalladhi sakhkhara lana hadha wa ma kunna. Like the reason you're doing that, you're like, oh, I'm driving this car, but I don't really have control over like imagine that. Every dua that you know now, think about it in this context. It's going to make so much, like all of life, like Islam and life will make sense now. The reason you read the dua is to remind you that you're about to get into this car, and فَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْحَافِظِينَ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of protectors, because even though I'm driving the car, I have no idea, like I have no idea if some guy's going to look at his phone and crash into me. So I don't have control over the game, I can just control over what I'm doing. And so even the dua, it's a key, or it's a spark to be able to like consciousness level. Like you go to the bathroom, there's a dua for that. You pray salah, there's consciousness level there. There's like every little aspect of deen, it's a trigger for you to increase your level of consciousness and be like, whoa, it's a game. And so when I get out of consciousness, sometimes I'll be like, alhamdulillah, or like I'll do a dhikr. Or what I've been trying to practice recently is I'll ask myself 3 questions. I'll say, who am I, where am I, and what am I doing? And that's one of the things that I found that's really been very good of like centering me in the present moment, and then making me realize like, oh, it's just a game. And then I'll center myself again. And so like I'm just constantly trying to just ground myself and center myself and bring my attention to the present moment, because at the end of the day, you can only play the game of life in the present moment, essentially.
Okay, I'm definitely gonna start doing that too, because in this past week where I've been like kind of two in my head about things, I think I was telling myself like, yeah, I'm gonna start meditating again. Like at some point I did for like a solid 20 days, like not a month even, but I was in that point where it's like, okay, you sit down, you breathe, you kind of get out of your head, you focus on your breathing to the point where it's like you don't let any of those thoughts that are coming in, you don't let yourself cling on to any of them. And the same way, I guess you were saying, you don't let yourself attach any emotions to them, and you just put yourself in this different state of mind. And I've tried to view Salah in that way, and I think over time I just kind of lost that attachment. But that's a very interesting way to put it, where in that process of getting those thoughts and attaching those feelings, before that even happens, you kind of just pull back and you just get yourself in that state where you remember that this is just a game, this is just life, this is just how it's going to be, and you can't control anything.
And you observe the thoughts. So when you have a higher level of consciousness, when your taqwa level is up there, then what you're doing is you're in a state of observing your thoughts, and then you observe the feelings that come as a result of those thoughts. Because it's not like you're going to become this emotionless human being, right? All you're doing though is that you're separating yourself from your thoughts. The biggest deception of the nafs is that the nafs makes you think that you are your thoughts. Like you have this thought and you're like, oh man, you have this thought like, oh, I'm not attractive, or I'm not smart, or I'm not this. And then you start to like attach meaning to it, and you start like, oh, that's me, I'm this. But you are not that. Like who you are right now is irrespective of the thoughts. You observe the thoughts, and you now realize that your thoughts could come in from the news, your thoughts could come in from your dad saying something about you, your thoughts could come in from, somebody told you something else. Like you don't have control over the thoughts that come into your head, but you do have control over the thoughts that you choose to entertain and make as a part of you, essentially.
So in those times where you kind of do let those emotions kind of overwhelm you, and I'm assuming it's not like a 100% solution to everything. Like you can't just assume that you'll always be perfectly fine. But for you, what do you feel like is something that when you fall into those like, do you think when you fall into those like slumps, I guess, is it because you just forgot about that, about life being a game, about consciousness, and then something as simple as just bringing back taqwa or consciousness then it's the solution to like.
That's it. That's literally it. When you find yourself getting wrapped up in life, it's because you've forgotten the fact of reality, which is that like it's all just a game and you are not your thoughts. You've forgotten that fact. When you forget that fact, you then become victim to riding the roller coaster of thoughts. What has happened is that your thoughts have taken the control of the steering wheel and they're taking you on a joyride, baby. Like you're just going hardcore, like you're riding the roller coaster of thoughts because you forgot the fact that like you are not your thoughts and you observe your thoughts. You are not necessarily your thoughts.
Okay. Sorry, I'm sitting here like this is the solution
you're like
to
having
everything
a
I've
meta
been feeling.
moment. Yeah. No, 100. That's why I wanted to talk about it, because when you talked about these topics, I wanted to have like a whole session where I could explain this topic to you. And so I agree with you, like using tools like meditation, because of the fact that we were not taught Islam properly. Like if you do Islam and you have a proper understanding of the words and salah, the dua, all these things, this is why my biggest gripe with like how we were raised as Muslims and the ummah as a general right now is because we don't even have the tools in our arsenal to be able to utilize the things that are supposed to put us in the state of taqwa. We can't even understand what in the heck we're talking about here, right? And so that's why sometimes you have to utilize, like, it's almost like this muscle that we've forgotten on how to be deliberate and attentive and conscious. And so you have to sometimes use meditation and sometimes these other things as tools. A lot of people use meditation, they kind of go into like, my salah is supposed to be for my meditation, and like, why am I using meditation? I should be using salah. But no, meditation, and sometimes people use meditation as like, oh, it's for Hindus or Buddhists and all this stuff. But meditation is a tool that you can utilize in order to scratch that muscle. Like it's almost like when you have muscle atrophy, like you haven't used your muscles in a long time. In today's world, many people have forgotten what it means to be attentive and like actually not be victim of their thoughts. And so sometimes you have to utilize these tools in order to actually like wake up that muscle of like, oh, okay, I am in control of my life, not my thoughts. Like I can control the character, my character doesn't control me. And then you can start to utilize those muscles in your salah, in your adhkar, and slowly build yourself back up to where your salah is the critical thing that puts you in that state. But in the beginning, sometimes I found when I work with people, it's hard to do that from the very beginning.
That's interesting too, because that makes it, thinking of it that way makes it feel better when you do fall off or you do get in a slump, because you know it's a muscle that you have to practice and like put repetition in order to actually stay with it. Like in those times where you don't feel like praying or you don't feel like just doing anything, you I guess are self-aware of the fact that this is just part of the journey in getting to the point where you can do this subconsciously, which I don't think is a... Do you think this is like kind of like a tangent? I have another question, but do you think it's possible to get to the point where like this is just like muscle memory, or do you think it's like always something that we have to...
So the cool thing about this is you can get to the point where after you understand that, okay, when I get conscious, I immediately feel gratitude, I immediately feel happiness, I immediately feel contentment, right? Then what you do is after a while, your brain starts to link up these activities that you do to remind yourself about reality to happiness and these good feelings that you get, these good emotions. And so what ends up happening is you actually develop an addiction to this remembering reality, because you're like, every time I remember reality, I still feel so much better. And so then you start to be like, if you get to the point where you build up the memory where salah starts to become that catalyst for you, you start to become addicted to salah, because you're like, bro, every time I feel salah, I feel this level of like clarity on my life. And so I just want more of that clarity all the time. And so you get to the point where you start to become addicted to these activities that are giving you that clarity of life.
My mind is mush. So you view the world as a third person, you view your life as a game, and through these means of getting back to Allah consciousness or God consciousness, salah, fasting, or just meditation is like an external tool that isn't like Islamically attached, but it's still a tool that you can use to practice with that muscle. You experience the happiness and the joy from doing those acts that allow you to kind of pull back and see the world from a different perspective. And that in and of itself is something that becomes a loop over time, I guess.
Yeah, you get addicted to it.
Yeah.
But it starts first with understanding what we talked about, number one. Number one is first coming to the realization. It takes a little bit of time. Sometimes you have to either journal about it or really spend time thinking about it, because you have to first realize that happiness and contentment and my well-being comes from me separating myself from the video game and the character that I am right now. You have to first conceptually understand, like wrap your head around that. And you have to feel a little bit of like, oh, that makes sense. My contentment, like all of a sudden when I realize that how I look, my intelligence level, who my parents are, my socioeconomic state, all of that stuff is not dependent on my well-being, how I feel, all of those kinds of things. Once you feel this level of like contentment in your heart, where you're like, oh, like you feel this little like emotion, you're like, oh, like it's just like, life is just a game. It's not that serious. Like separate, like step back from it. You'll feel this level of like relief. Like the first time in your life, you'll feel this level of contentment. Okay, now you felt that. You've come to the realization that that is how it's supposed to be. You now need to come up with all the tools that are going to allow you to get to that state more regularly. In the beginning, it might be states like having to remind yourself 10 times an hour, like have a post-it note, like stay present, or like remind yourself who you are. Remember it's just a game, or whatever. That's one tool. Another tool could be meditation, 20 minutes every day. Another tool could be trying to understand salah, like all these things, right? That's step number 2. Utilizing the tools to cultivate this feeling, this realization more often. Then step number 3 is how do I then utilize deen and salah and the tools that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already given me to be able to cultivate step number 1. And then make that into a habit and be able to develop it from there to the point where you can utilize only the tools that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you to be able to elevate that level of taqwa that you have in your life.
I think that's a beautiful way to summarize everything that we talked about. And I guess I'll just call it a wrap at that, because that kind of brings us back full circle to the actual process by which we can actually achieve that. And jazakallah for myself, because this was something that actually helped me kind of click in terms of how I'm going to go about the rest of the week. And yeah, do you have any other closing thoughts?
Just go use this concept of taqwa to get your Lambo, because I guarantee you will make more money, you will have a better job, you will have better security with your family, you will feel better about yourself, you feel better about the world around you if you increase your level of consciousness and you don't take life so seriously. When you take life less seriously, life becomes fun. When life becomes fun, it becomes easier to get the things that you want in life, because all of a sudden it's just a game. And so go out there and get your Lambo because of that, because remember, it's just a game.
Hell yeah. We got our clickbait title right there.
There you go, bro. We're always looking to get Lambos in the title somehow. But I hope you guys found that valuable. I know that this session was a little bit more of like a therapeutic session, because I know that, I wanted to kind of talk to Sohail about these topics and kind of just dump it out there. But I think it's good for me as well, kind of a reminder for myself as well. So I hope you guys found value in this, inshallah. And please, if you guys found value in it, just give us a comment, let us know how things are going. And that's all. That's all we got for today. So, Sohail, do you have any closing comments?
Nah. You said it all. So we'll call it a wrap. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you, Yassine, for dropping bars. And yeah, that is the Sohail and Yassine podcast, episode number 3, I believe. Thank you guys for listening. Have a good day.
That's it. Check it out.
Deuces.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.